Jeremiah chapter 11. This chapter has the following: 1. God's covenant, verses 1 to 7. 2. Israel's disobedience, verses 8 to 10. 3. Evils to come on them, verses 11 to 17. 4. Evil on the men of Anathoth who conspired to kill Jeremiah, verses 18 to 23. Before we go to our Bible study, let us see how the law of the Lord was given to Moses. Exodus chapter 24. The Lord said to Moses to come up to the Lord with Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel. Then God gave him the words of the law. And Moses came and told the people all the words of the law and all the judgments, and all the people answered with one voice and said, All the words which the Lord hath said we will do. And Moses wrote all the words of the Lord. God also gave Moses the replacement of the previously broken 10 commandments here. The commandments go like this. First commandment, I am the Lord thy God. Thou shalt have no other gods but me. Second commandment, Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image. And so on till the 10th commandment. The book of the law of the Lord consisted of all the laws and commandments of the Lord in addition to the below. 1. The list of blessings upon obedience to the law, where God promised that He would be their God and they would be His people. Also, He promised that He would give them a land flowing with milk and honey. 2. The book of the law consisted of a list of curses upon disobedience of the law. This book of the law was lost during the reign of the kings from the house of the Lord. It was during Josiah's reign that this book was found during the temple renovation. Let me talk about Josiah's reforms and how the book of the law was found. Josiah, the great and good king of Judah, was 8 years old when he became king. In his 18th year, Josiah decided to follow the true living God of Israel, unlike his father Amon and his grandfather Manasseh. So he sent Shaphan, the scribe, to the house of the Lord, asking him to give the money collected for the house of the Lord to Hilkiah the high priest, to repair and renovate the house of the Lord.
High priest, is there not anything more that can make this people again return to the true God, the Lord God of Israel?
The house of the Lord was being repaired. It was then that Hilkiah found the book of the law in the house of the Lord. When the king had heard the words of the book of the law, he tore his clothes and said, Great is the Lord's anger that burns against us, because those who have gone before us have not obeyed the words of this book. They have not acted in accordance with all that is written there concerning us. 2 Kings 22:13. King Josiah, after reading the law, entered into a new form of covenant with the Lord to keep the Lord's commandments. 2 Kings 22:23 and 2 Chronicles chapter 34:35. The reform consisted of removing pagan altars and idols from the temple, destroying ritual sanctuaries and fertility cults, and centralizing worship at the temple of Jerusalem. We will see in this chapter that Jeremiah reads the words of the covenant from this book of the law. The covenant and the curse, verses 1 to 5. Verse 1. The word that came to Jeremiah from the Lord, saying. Here begins a new prophecy which is supposed to have been delivered in the first year of the reign of Zedekiah. It was from the Lord, and so is to be regarded with great attention. Verse 2. Hear ye the words of this covenant, and speak unto the men of Judah and to the inhabitants of Jerusalem. The words of this covenant alludes to the book of the law, Deuteronomy 31:26, found in the temple during Josiah's temple renovation. The book of the law has the covenant of the law of God delivered by Moses, to which the people promised obedience. Exodus 24:7-8. In verses 3 to 5, God spoke unto the men of Judah and to the inhabitants of Jerusalem about the blessings and curses given in the book of the covenant. Blessings upon obedience and curse upon disobedience. Deuteronomy chapters 27 and 28. After God spoke about the terms of the covenant and ended his speech, Jeremiah says in verse 5, "So be it, O Lord." The prophet was literally asserting the truth of which God had said and wishing that the people would do according to their covenant in Deuteronomy chapters 27 and 28. The command to preach the message of the broken covenant, verses 6 to 8. In verse 6, God told Jeremiah to read the same covenant with the blessings and the curses in every city of Judah and in all the streets of Jerusalem, that all the people may know their duty, their privileges, and their danger. Verse 7, "For I earnestly protested unto your fathers in the day that I brought them up out of the land of Egypt, even unto this day, rising early and protesting, saying, Obey my voice." That is, from the time of the giving of the law, in all successive ages to the present time, he had sent his prophets to them time after time, morning by morning, early and late, to press, exhort, and stir them up in all obedience to his will, and to warn them of the dangers which would come upon disobedience of it. Verse 8 says that though they had such strong solicitations and fair warnings, and these repeated again and again, they still continued in their disobedience and stubbornness. Consequently, the Lord had brought all the curses warned of in the covenant upon them. The conspiracy of disobedience, verses 9-10. Verse 9, "And the Lord said unto me, A conspiracy is found among the men of Judah and among the inhabitants of Jerusalem." A conspiracy is a deflection from the covenant. The conspiracy was the work of both breaking the commandments of God and refusing to hear the warnings of God. It ended up being a conspiracy to break their covenant with God. Breaking covenant with the Lord meant making the covenant with other gods. Verse 10. There are two views of when this conspiracy occurred. 1. Bible scholar Dumelo thought it happened during the reign of Josiah, the good king of Judah. There were some bad people who deliberately conspired against God and against Josiah's reformation. 2. But Bible scholar Henderson thought it happened during the first 4 years of the reign of Josiah's son Jehoiakim. After the death of Josiah, all the people who were hostile to Josiah's reforms bound themselves to introduce again all the idolatrous practices popularized by Ammon, Manasseh, and Ahaz, which had been abolished by Josiah. So attractive was idolatry for the people of Judah and Jerusalem that they deliberately conspired to break their covenant with God and make covenant with other gods. The curse to come upon the covenant breakers, verses 11 to 14. In loyalty to his covenant, the Lord had to bring curses upon the people upon disobedience. The curses that fell upon Israel were famine, the sword, and captivity. Baal's idolatry was publicly established in every city and street in Judah. In distress, the people of Judah went to their innumerable gods which they had in every city, and even to the innumerable altars of Baal that they had established in every street to burn incense, and cried unto them for help. Shameful things were done in the worship of it. Their many gods and many altars failed to help them. Deliverance was in vain. Since they failed to seek the living God, God in his anger decides in verse 14 to neither listen to their cry or listen to the intercessory cry of the prophet for them. Of all the curses that might come upon the people, surely one of the most terrible is the silence of God in our time of need and trouble. God was silent. God was determined to give them up into the hands of the enemies. The climax of their guilt was reached. The disappointment of rejected love, verses 15 to 17. Verse 15. What hath my beloved to do in mine house, seeing she hath wrought lewdness with many, and the holy flesh is passed from thee? When thou doest evil, then thou rejoicest. God once regarded Israel as his beloved, and she had the liberty of being in his house. But she had been an unfaithful spouse and broken the marriage covenant with God. Therefore, God appropriately asks why they are still in his house. The holy flesh is passed from thee. It means that the lewd and immoral practices of the people have robbed them of that holiness without which no man can see God. The flesh of abominations cannot be mingled with the holy flesh. When thou doest evil, then thou rejoicest. Instead of repenting of sin and mourning for it, or being humbled at the approaching judgments, they gave themselves up to sensual lusts and pleasures. They neither grieved for sin nor trembled at punishment. Verse 16. The Lord called thy name a green olive tree, fair and of goodly fruit. With the noise of a great tumult, he hath kindled fire upon it, and the branches of it are broken. The olive tree was naturally a symbol of fertility and goodness. As an olive tree that is beautiful in form and comely in sight, whose branches overshadow the trees, so the Lord had magnified Israel among the people. But now that she had transgressed the law, the armies of the law, who are as strong as fire, that is, the Babylonians, shall come against her to burn her up. In verse 17, Israel means the northern kingdom and Judah means the southern kingdom. Evil was done in the house of Israel and the house of Judah. That is, the whole nation had worshipped Baals and provoked God's anger, and God's reason for punishment is a sufficient vindication of his justice. Jeremiah's knowledge of the threat against him, verses 18-19. Verse 18 says that the men of Anathoth had conspired against Jeremiah's life because he reproved them of their sins, denounced the judgments of God against them, and revealed the fate of the Judahites. So, God had given him a knowledge of it by a secret warning that he might be on his guard. This was an example of divine protection over the prophet. In verse 19, since his own people at Anathoth wanted to kill him, Jeremiah says that he lived there like a lamb or an ox that is brought to a slaughter because he did not know the devices planned against him. His people want to cut the tree with the fruit thereof. Jeremiah is the tree, his teaching the fruit. They conspired to destroy the prophet and his prophecies. They wanted to destroy the cause and the effect together. Jeremiah's faithfulness to God built in him a growing likeness to the Messiah. We find the below two similarities of Jeremiah with Jesus. 1. In Isaiah's great prophecy of the suffering servant, he described the Messiah as a lamb to the slaughter. Isaiah 53:7. 2. Just as Christ was rejected in his hometown of Nazareth, people in Jeremiah's hometown Anathoth wanted to kill him, reminding us of John 4:44, where Jesus himself testified that a prophet hath no honor in his own country. Jeremiah's prayer and confidence. Verse 20. Since no justice can be done to Jeremiah by men, the prophet appeals to the righteous God, the judge of the whole earth, who knew both the innocency of his heart toward the people and the malice of their hearts toward him, and desires that God would avenge them and that he might see his vengeance on them. God's promise to punish the ones who threatened to kill Jeremiah, verses 21-23. When the men of Anathoth attempted to silence the prophecies of Jeremiah by threatening to kill him, the providence and protection of God preserved the prophet's life through the dreadful dangers to which he was exposed. In verse 22 and 23, we see that the visible vengeance of God followed closely the prosecutors of his faithful messenger Jeremiah. God visited their iniquities and brought evil upon the men of Anathoth. 1. The young men shall die by the sword, their sons and their daughters shall die by famine. Verse 22. 2. There shall be no remnant of them, for I will bring evil upon the men of Anathoth, even the year of their visitation. Jeremiah chapter 11. Questions. Jeremiah chapter 11. Answers.